So I am Kristen O'Hara, Director of Interpretation at Pajarito Environmental Education Center, or PEAC as we like to call it, located in Los Alamos, New Mexico. I will be the moderator for tonight's talk. PEAC is, of course, the nonprofit that organizes and operates the Los Alamos Nature Center. Visit our website, PEEC Nature, peaknature.org, to learn more about visiting the Nature Center and about our upcoming events. I'd like to send a special shout out to PEAC's wonderful members, donors, and volunteers for your generous support. Thank you so much. To learn more about becoming a PEAC member or donor or volunteer, please visit peaknature.org. Or if you're with us in person today, you can grab a brochure on your way out. Bob, I know you're a member, so thank you. Okay, just a few logistics for this presentation before we get started. This talk is a hybrid talk, meaning there are folks tuning in virtually on Zoom and folks in person at the Nature Center. For those tuning in on Zoom, please note that you will not be able to see our presenter on video tonight, just Gabe's slides. For questions, our presenter will be taking questions via Zoom chat and from the in-person audience. To find the chat feature in Zoom, look for the Zoom app menu bar and type your questions into the chat. I will relay the questions from Zoom and in the room at the end of the presentation. So we're holding all questions, even in-person questions, till the very end. For those of you on Zoom, sometimes there's a delay when we are listening to questions from the live audience. Don't worry, we'll be back in a second and try our best to remember to repeat the questions for everyone to hear. If for some reason we do not repeat the questions, we are only human after all, please gently remind us. All right. Of course, after this talk, you will receive a short evaluation. Please take a moment to fill that evaluation out. Your input helps us improve future programming. Thank you in advance. Okay, so let's get started. A bit about tonight's presenter. Gabe has a strong interest in human dimensions of natural resource management. He wants to develop forest and fire management that strengthens the connection between rural communities and the surrounding forest land. He holds a BA in Environmental Studies from Lewis and Clark College and a master's in Forest Ecosystems and Society from Oregon State University College of Forestry. Gabe is a Type 2 wildland firefighter with years of experience with prescribed fire in northern New Mexico. All right, Gabe, I'm going to turn it over to you and I'll monitor the chat. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Kristen. It's a real treat to be here tonight. I'm excited to talk about fire and forestry with you all. Just want to thank Pajarito Environmental Education Center. This is a wonderful facility to be in. If you haven't been here in person, you really should come check it out. And we're kind of working through a quick switcheroo on the tech here. But yeah, as Kristen said, I've had, the pleasure of being able to study a lot about forestry in the time that I've been in the Northwest, where I grew up. I spent a lot of time at Oregon State University studying forestry at the College of Forestry there. And then since moving to New Mexico, I've worked with the Forest Stewards Guild for about 5 years now. And in my time with the Guild, I've gotten to do a lot of different project work, a wide variety of things. And I hope to be able to kind of share some of my experience working with the Guild and kind of studying forestry with you all tonight. No worries. Is it glitching? We're kind of working through a quick tech situation over here. I'll just tell you a little bit about the organization that I work with now. As I said, it's called the Forest Stewards Guild. We're a nationwide nonprofit that's based out of Santa Fe, New Mexico. And the organization came to be in the 90s, in response to a lot of the issues with federal land management and kind of clear cutting that led to the spotted owl litigation and kind of the real changes in the forest industry in the 90s, the Forest Stewards Guild came to be out of a need to support foresters in managing forest land in a way that was ecologically appropriate. So shifting from just an emphasis on timber production to managing forest land for other values. And so that was nationwide that the Forest Stewards Guild played this role of science synthesis to help foresters understand how they could manage their land in a way that was ecologically, economically, and socially appropriate. And so we still do that today. In the Southwest, you can't really talk about forest without also talking about fire. That's the nature of the forest that we live in. And so I'll talk about that tonight. That's really a large focus of the talk. Okay, we're gonna work through one more glitch here. Yeah, so in my work with the guild, we do everything from research, partnering with academic institutions, to landscape scale forest restoration projects, which work across boundaries. We're talking large, hundreds of thousands of acres, landscape scale. And the nature of those projects is that you really do have to work with everyone. We work with tribal governments, we work with federal land management agencies, we work with state government, we work with municipalities, county governments, every entity that those landscapes cross, we have to learn to kind of collaborate with and plan with. And that's one of the things that we do well. We work in that space of kind of collaboration and kind of having conversations about our values on the landscape. We also have a variety of other programs. We get to work with youth across northern New Mexico. We have a Forest Stewards Youth Corps, and we have 5 different youth corps across the state where we kind of play this role of workforce development and job training for forestry, which there's a huge need for. We have a lot of work to do to bring our forests into in a way that is ecologically resilient. And we need a workforce to do that. And so that's one thing that the Guild does well is we help train young people to kind of be able to work in the woods. And this is really important for the rural communities in northern New Mexico. There's a lot of folks that really value their ability to work in the woods. And so we try and support that kind of culture and that rural livelihood by doing job training. And that really informs a lot of the work that we do. Getting out there and connecting with these communities helps everything that we do. And those landscape scale projects, a lot of times we know people that live and work right adjacent to that project personally. And so that's a huge value to our organization. And that kind of filters into everything we do, even up into the research. We also do a lot of education and outreach, like what we're doing tonight. I'm really excited to be here. I really get a kick out of being able to talk to people about fire and forestry. And so we're involved in a number of coalitions and collaboratives that kind of talk about how to manage watersheds and kind of forested areas in an ecologically appropriate way. We also coordinate the Fire Adapted New Mexico Learning Network, which is all about sharing opportunities for peer learning. So neighbor to neighbor, peer to peer information sharing and relationship building. And so we recognize the value of personal connections in getting work done. A lot of times, if you know the right person, you can do something a lot faster or more effectively. And so that's something that we support as an organization, is kind of getting people together and trying to kind of learn from one another. That's very much in our DNA. I think we're off to the races here. Okay. All right. And so here's my information here on this first slide. I encourage you, if you have questions, I'll have this email at the end of the talk as well. If questions come up that we don't get to, I encourage you to please reach out. We'd love to hear more from y'all. I kind of already touched on the work that the Guild does, so I'll skip through this pretty quickly here. We have, like I said, just a wide variety of different program work across the state, across the region, and across the country broadly. It's a large organization that's growing, and we're actually hiring right now. So if you're out there and you're looking for work, the Guild is growing quickly. So please take a look at our webpage and see if there might be a role that fits your skill set. Here's a quick kind of roadmap of where we're heading. We're going to talk about fire. We're going to talk about prescribed fire, but I want to frame up the rationale for the use of prescribed fire tonight. There's a lot of we're very fortunate in this area, particularly in the Jemez Mountains where I'm kind of standing right now, a lot of good data about kind of the role of fire in these landscapes. And we're very fortunate to have that. And so I'm going to try and share some of that with you all. And then we'll talk about prescribed fire and kind of how that's used and why that's used towards the end. And so this is kind of where we're heading. I'm going to talk about a variety of different ecosystem types. We'll talk about ponderosa pine, pinyon juniper, mixed conifer like a spruce fir systems, and then we'll talk about bosque as well. And then finally, like I said, we'll talk about those restoration tools. Okay, let's jump right in. So when we're talking about prescribed fire, really the rationale for the use of fire as a tool comes from the study of fire ecology. And this is about the relationship of plants and animals in the forested systems that we're talking about to fire. All different systems have some relationship or pattern of fire on the landscape. Some of them maybe don't see fire very often, others see it very frequently. And so that pattern of fire, that relationship of fire, is part of the fire ecology of a system. Each of these different systems have different causes of fire. They might have lightning ignited fire, they might have, and now we're starting to see more human ignited fire. We're seeing different causes of fire. And those fires have different consequences in each of these different systems, depending on the way that they're structured and the types of species that are represented in that system. So we'll talk a little bit about that. The presence of fire is importantly it's affected by this triangle of three factors, which is the fuel, the atmospheric conditions, or the weather, and an ignition source. So this is what fire managers, we love our triangles in the fire world. Every year, I swear there's a new fire triangle. It's kind of a running joke. But this is the original fire triangle, which is fuel, weather, and ignition. Those are the three things that you need to support fire. And this is both a chemical and a physical process with biological, ecological, and as we've seen recently, social consequences. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Certain types of ecosystems are what we refer to as fire adapted. And these are ecosystems that are capable of surviving wildfire and or using resources created by wildfire. So some systems actually I'm not trying to anthropomorphize them. They maybe not but they're evolved or adapted to have fire as a functional trait within that ecosystem, or a functional process, And so, there are these fire adapted ecosystems. And so this is an often occurring natural process in these systems, and that these plants and organisms are prepared for, and they're actually capable of recovering from. And so this is, of course, talking about the ecology of these systems without kind of the human influence of fire suppression. But we'll talk more about that as well. There are multiple different traits that, or strategies that make an ecosystem adapted to fire. Some, like the ponderosa pine, for example, have resistance traits. For example, thick bark can protect a ponderosa pine and keep their stem away from that high temperature. And so this prevents hydraulic failure, which basically, limits the ponderosa pine's availability of water through the stem. That thick bark protects it. If you've ever been up close to ponderosa pine, they have almost like a jigsaw-like interlocking bark. And when that bark gets hot, it actually pops, and those smoldering pieces of bark will shoot off of the tree keeping that heat away from the tree. In my experience on prescribed fire, I've seen ponderosa pine withstand great temperatures, and then I've come back and they're fully alive and they're capable of dealing with lower severity fire that kind of is swirling around their base, for example. There are fire adaptation traits that allow a species to recover from fire. So, for example, quaking aspen are a good species to point to here. They are the first to come back after fire because they have a root system that allows them to sprout quickly in the post-fire environment and to kind of come up after the fire, so they can recover quickly. And we see aspen as a, kind of some of the first to come back after fire. And then finally, the recruit strategy. This is an example of this is serotinous pine cones. Lodgepole pine, for example, have serotinous pine cones. They will only let go of their seeds when they've experienced fire. And so they're recruiting their seeds into that post-fire environment. They want to be the first ones on that freshly burned, fertile soil. And that species has evolved over, very, very long time cycles to kind of have traits that allow it to succeed in that post-fire environment, to be effective in a relationship with fire. So that serotiny is a good example of the recruitment. And how do we know that our forests are fire adapted? How can we use data to actually prove this? Well, we have fire history records. We can go back using tree cores. We can kind of drill into trees and pull out and look at tree rings and see where the fire burned in the growth cycle of that tree, to tell us and to kind of cross-reference across the landscape which trees experience the same fires, and we can use those record trees to kind of create a record of fire on the landscape. So here you can see on the graph here, each one of these lines is a different tree, different record tree. And the lines that correlate, like the vertical lines, are where each one of those horizontal lines experience the same fire. And so you can see big fires that impacted many trees in the record, like this line here. You can see some that were smaller and maybe only affected a couple trees or a localized area, but you can start to see kind of where bigger fires impacted a large area in the landscape. And so you can start to, with statistical methods and databases, they can do really sophisticated studies, kind of triangulating across the landscape where each tree or where these different trees experience the same fires, and they can kind of reconstruct what the stands would have looked like. Here's an example of a cross section of a tree that you can see kind of tells kind of the fire history of this tree. You can see the different dates going way back to 1487 when it experienced its first fire. Each one of these, this is from a cat face, as they call it. This burn scar in the side of a tree is where fire has repeatedly burned into that tree over hundreds of years. And then the tree will heal, and then it'll burn again. And when we cut this cross section, we can see the different burns that tree experienced, and we can actually cross-reference them. And so that helps us, we can use cross-dating, and we can actually tell the year and the season that those fires were experienced. And because trees don't move, it's spatially explicit. We know exactly where that fire impacted that tree and at what time. And so we can use that to really create a pretty robust network of fire scars. And that's what scientists Craig Allen, Ellis Margolis, and Tom Swetnam have done a lot of work on in the Jemez Mountains, and actually outside in the Sangres as well. There's been a lot of this type of analysis. Here's an example of that fire scar network as well. You can see some of the data of the on the left in this map here of kind of where the spatially explicit data comes from. And so yeah, this fire scar network tells us kind of the history of fire on the landscape, and we can see how frequently it burned. And because of the frequency that we see that it burned at, we know that these forests were very adapted to fire. They saw fire very regularly. And then what happened? We started to see changes in land management with, European settlement, land use patterns shifting across the West. This had a drastic effect on how the role that fire played in the landscape. And the first way that that happened was through what's called fire exclusion. This is not now, in our day and age, we talk about fire suppression. And I want to make a distinction between exclusion and suppression. Suppression is the active putting out of fire. That's using water and actually putting out an ignition. Exclusion is kind of passively removing fire from the landscape. So grazing, running thousands of sheep up a riparian area, for example, and removing the grass vegetation from that system is going to change how fire will burn in that landscape passively. And so factors like that, grazing, high grade logging, removing, trees and kind of creating a road network that's going to stop the spread of fire through the landscape are all ways that are going to passively influence the spread of fire through the landscape. And so that was the first kind of phase of this, was fire exclusion. Another part of fire exclusion is laws that limited the use of indigenous fire. There were many tribes in the Southwest that used fire as a tool to steward their medicinal plant species, for crop species, for many different reasons. And preventing indigenous people from using fire is another way that fire was excluded from the landscape, because that was an important part of the cultural use of that fire. Okay. Here's a example of the you see all these sheep on the photo here. It's on your right. And yeah, you can think about year after year how much of the grass vegetation would be removed by animals like that. And that's really important for spreading fire. That grass is really the kind of conveyor belt that moves fire through the landscape year after year in a frequent fire system. And without that grass, you don't get that fire moving in the way that it would naturally. Then came fire suppression. This is the one that's more familiar to us today. This is, the large investment in putting out fires. And we have gotten very effective at this. There's this 10 a.m. rule back in the early 1900s that basically said that if a fire started one day, it needed to be out by 10 a.m. the next day. It's called the 10 a.m. policy. And there was tons of investment to make the Forest Service basically a fire management organization. And they still play that role today. We've gotten very sophisticated at putting out fires and for understandable reasons, but we've kind of created our worst nightmare in doing that. By actively suppressing fire from the landscape, we're seeing fires that we can no longer put out. And we'll talk about that. And so how do you all, I can ask you, Bob, how do you think that fire suppression has influenced forests, by putting out fire for so long? Mm-hmm. 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 That's exactly it. Exactly. It's kind of, it goes from nothing to too much. Yeah, Bob just described to us, that you're going to start to see changes in the fuel that you see, or the vegetation there, maybe more shrubs, more connectivity between the vegetation. And so you can put out fire for a while, but when you do get it on the landscape, it becomes very hard to put out. Exactly. And so again, I want to talk about, before, we're kind of talking about this change in the role of fire on the landscape, and I want to talk about cultural burning. This is going to take a little bit to describe here, but in the graph on the left, what you have here is precipitation levels from 6 to -6, with the blue being high precipitation and the red being low precipitation. And then you have from -3 to 3 being the years. 3 years before fire and 3 years after fire. So this is the year of the fire. So you have the 3 years before and the 3 years after, and the precipitation before and the precipitation after. And what we see before the Pueblo Revolt, when indigenous folks were using fire more regularly, is that the role of precipitation in the fire, the effect of the fire, is basically decoupled. You don't see the kind of the effect of precipitation on how the fire burned, because they were burning so regularly, that they kept that vegetation in such a way that it wasn't allowed to kind of grow back in kind of tremendous amounts. Here on this post-Pueblo Revolt, you see the vegetation kind of is able to grow very much after the fire. This is a study by Chris Ruse that's actually done in the Jemez Range, and it just describes the relationship of frequent fire in this landscape of some of the Jemez people. And so basically what this is showing is that they burn so regularly that the vegetation wasn't the factor, but it was actually kind of the ignition that was kind of driving the relationship with fire. And it was a practice of igniting fire and burning it for multiple purposes, for vegetation growth, to attract game species such as deer, and to promote medicinal plants, a wide variety of things the Jemez people used fire for. And so all of these changes, from exclusion to suppression to kind of the loss of cultural burning, have left to a huge shift in kind of what the fuel looks like and kind of what our forests look like. On the left, you can see kind of pre-fire suppression, and you can see all the grasslands that would have been, and kind of the more spaced out system that you have here with frequent fire. On the right, you can see that much of that grassland has been filled in with dense forest. And that's because fire has been removed from this landscape. And so you start to see more trees filling in. And when you see more fuel built up, you have these denser forests that are going to have different fire behavior when we do get fire, just like Bob was mentioning. And so this kind of brings in this conversation of what's called fire regime. That as we've removed fire from the landscape, we've kind of changed the fire regime of many forests. We've affected kind of the role of fire. And here are some of the things that influence what's called fire regime. Fire regime is a fancy way of talking about an ecosystem's relationship with fire. It's a term that we use to describe an ecosystem's relationship with fire. And the things that make up a fire regime are the frequency that system experiences fire, the extent that it experiences fire. So how large do the fires get in terms of acreage, the intensity, which is how hot did the fires get, how long are the flame lengths, how hot does it get, the severity, which is how much of the vegetation dies, basically, or kind of the effects of that fire on mortality and things like that. What season does it burn in? Is it a kind of a monsoon, lightning strike type thing, or something else? Is it regular or irregular in terms of its predictability? And then the spatial effect. So is it patchy or is it contiguous? So these are the different kind of attributes of a fire regime. And we're not going to get super into all of those, but I just wanted to mention that this is kind of how fire scientists talk about the relationship of ecosystems to fire. And we have different kind of factors that kind of lead into the fire regime. And these are the triangles I was talking about. I said fire scientists, they love their triangles. So this is, we love our triangles. I have my own, set. There's one for every kind of aspect of fire and forestry. I swear there's a different triangle. But this is the fire regime triangle up here, which is climate, ignition, and vegetation. This is kind of at the largest time scale that we're talking about, decades to millennia. And this is at kind of a regional scale, like spatially. When we talk about fire behavior, we're talking about with days. We're talking about an individual wildfire. How is that fire, that individual fire behaving in the day-to-day? And that's weather. We're talking about, daily weather forecasts. We're talking about hill slopes and kind of the topography and drainages and, getting more specific with that landscape. And we're talking about the fuel type. Maybe there's shrubs in this canyon, and the canyon next to it, maybe there's trees. That differences in fuel at a more local scale is kind of the fire behavior triangle. And then at the most small scale, we have our most basic fire behavior triangle, which is oxygen, heat, fuel. That's like, what do you need to start a candle or to start to light a match? And so that's kind of the most local scale. And so you can see how there's different scales that fire operates on, and that's going to be kind of how we think about the role of fire. This is the kind of when I was talking about fire behavior, when I was saying weather, topography, those are in the fuel types. That's what influences fire behavior. And so when we're talking about a wildfire, like the Cerro Pelado fire near here last year, we're talking about fire behavior on that fire. We're not talking so much about the fire regime of that fire. We're talking about fire behavior. And so we're talking about the difference, different types of fire. Some fires on the surface, not surprisingly, we call that surface fire, like on the forest floor. We might see some passive crown fire, which is where one tree torches out. And then sometimes we see active crown fire, which is where it's torching tree to tree to tree, canopy to canopy to canopy, and it's killing the great majority of those trees, which leads to what we call a high severity fire. So when we see a lot of trees dying, that means the severity is getting higher. Low severity is maybe more of a surface fire. And so different types of fire behavior, can tell us something about, what the effects might be after the fire. This is a map of kind of the fire regimes across New Mexico. I wish I had a better reference here. New Mexico, you can kind of see is here. All of this green over here, the dark green, is grassland. And that fire regime is the group 2, which is a less than 35-year fire return interval with replacement severity. And that's not surprising, right? In a grass fire, you'd expect it to replace all of that grass. It's going to kill all the grass. And you'd expect it frequently and without suppression. We're talking about before fire suppression, because lightning strikes would light that grass and it would burn. Over here in the purple, that's going to be a group 4 fire regime class. That's going to be a longer fire return interval. That's up in kind of the mountaintops up there in the purple. And that's going to be a 35 to 200-year fire return interval with replacement severity. So we're talking about kind of high elevation spruce fir up in the high mountains, where those forests, they don't see fire very often, but when they do, it's tree to tree to tree, because there's a lot of close canopy forest up in there. And so this kind of just shows, the different relationships of fire across the state of New Mexico. You can see there's a variety, and you can see there's blending and kind of, areas where there's maybe intermix and changes. But what you can see here too is that there's definitely a signal with elevation. In our mountain tops, you're going to see higher severity fires, more of that kind of longer fire return intervals in those high elevation forests. And as we go down in elevation into the kind of ponderosa pine, you see different types of relationships with fire. And that's this idea of how fire regime, kind of the relationship of fire, is going to vary by the type of forest that you're in. And so we'll talk about different forests and their relationship with fire. The kind of poster child, the quintessential fire adapted forest, is the ponderosa pine forest. And this is typically a frequent low severity fire that we would see in ponderosa pine. There'd be grass understory, and ponderosa pine, as you know, they actually drop pine needles, which creates a pretty consistent fuel bed and allows fire to spread pretty consistently at a low severity through those systems. So they kind of create their own fuel conditions in a way. They also drop their lower branches. So they have the canopies of these trees are higher up. And so fire can't get up into the canopy as easily. So they're very adapted to that surface fire. And it would have happened regularly, because another thing we know about ponderosa pine is that the elevation that we see ponderosa pine forests at is also where we get a lot of dry lightning strikes. So they have ignition, they have fuel conditions, and they have that typically that topography for low severity fire. And as you can see here, you can see a historical photo of a ponderosa pine forest, and you can see how widely spaced these would have been. Because as fire moved through that landscape frequently, it would have killed the great majority of young trees. Some of them would have survived and would have made it into the next age class and would have become more resistant to fire as they grew. But the great majority of them would have been killed by that frequent fire. And that protected the trees that remained. The trees that remained were resilient to fire because it could come as much as it did, and because of the structure of the forest, they were kind of protected from it. And so they were adapted to frequent low severity ground fire. They had low intensity, high frequency fire. It was very often, but not that hot, not that long flame lengths. So this photo is from 1880. So this is before fire suppression and before some fire exclusion. And now you can see, and this is the type of fire I was trying to describe earlier. I've seen this a lot in prescribed fire, where fire will actually swirl around the base of a ponderosa pine, and it looks like it's going to kill the tree, and then you come back the next year and that tree is fine because of the thickness of the bark and the traits of this species. But you can see the small tree next to it is actually, it's in trouble. And if you've heard the phrase ladder fuels, which is where small trees grow under big trees and kind of create a pathway for fire to move into the larger trees, by this tree dying at a seedling, it's actually protecting this larger tree because it's removing that kind of vertical continuity of fuel. And so that's a really, it's something that we actually work towards, is to kind of remove that ladder fuels for these ponderosa pine forests, so that we can protect those larger trees that are very resistant to fire. So we're seeing changes in ponderosa pine trees. We're seeing, as you can see here, there's a photo of, the very dense, small diameter ponderosa pine forest that we see a lot of. We'd like to kind of get to conditions where we have larger, more resilient forests, because if we got fire in this one with a lot of trees, they would all die. And we'd like to have forests stick around on the landscape where possible. And so we want to make them resilient to fire, because we're going to get fire. And so here's, some photos of just some of the large wildfires. This is the Waldo Canyon fire. Fires like this, we're seeing larger wildfires like this are kind of what we're thinking of when we're doing forest treatments. We want to make sure that certain areas within this fire scar are resilient to fires. They can withstand fire moving through them, so that they can be there to reestablish forests in the post-fire environment. We need to have those seed sources. We need to have those forests in the landscape, patches of forest or mosaics of areas that have that structure that can withstand fire, so that after large fires, there's seed sources and there's, some kind of diversity of burn effects, versus what we're seeing now is kind of homogeneous burn effects, large patches of high severity fire that remove seed sources and have really devastating effects on waterways at huge spatial scales. We need to get back to that kind of mosaic of fire on the landscape that we've lost. Here's another example right here in this area. This is from the Cerro Grande fire. This is Upper Frijoles watershed. I'm sure many of you have seen the effects of this fire firsthand if you're in the Los Alamos area. Maybe you lived through this fire. This was a very scary event. Large scale, high severity fire. Okay. I now want to talk about a different system, the pinyon juniper ecosystems. There are many different types of pinyon juniper ecosystems. This is important because this is a very common forest ecosystem in New Mexico. Many of you maybe live in this system. There's a wide variety of PJ out there. That's the short for pinyon juniper. There's savannas, shrublands, and persistent woodlands, to say the least. Those are three of the broad categories. There are many different blends of them that are not within that broad category. they're shaped by fire, but they have kind of a less clear relationship with fire than ponderosa pine. They've been heavily impacted by humans because of where they're at in the elevation. These are typically, as you know, where a lot of human communities are in. A lot of the wildland urban interface is in the pinyon juniper systems. They're very susceptible to drought, insects, and fire. We've seen massive die-offs in pinyon juniper from beetles in recent years. And so we're actually, there's concern about that. This accounts for more than 50% of New Mexico's forests, these PJ systems. Here's some different photos. You can see kind of a savanna or kind of a grassland on the left, going all the way over to a more persistent woodland on the far right where there's large trees. Again, here's the savanna. You can see the grass in between. This type of system maybe would have seen more frequent and less intense fire because of the grass component here. So this is one type of PJ that would have had a more frequent fire forest. You can see, how spaced out the trees are. Fire would behave in this kind of similar to ponderosa pine in the way that it would move through the landscape. We also have shrublands. These are going to have less frequent fire because there's kind of a lack of surface fuel. So there's not a lot of grass component here. And so it's not going to burn until you have 50-mile-an-hour winds. And when you have those 50-mile-an-hour winds, it's going to kill a lot of it. So that's kind of the trade-off here is when you don't have that fine fuel or that grass component, it means that it's going to be a more stand-replacing fire when it does happen because you're going to need big winds to carry that fire from tree to tree. So historically, there were stand-replacing fires in kind of those shrublands or those persistent woodlands with a long fire return interval because of that lack of grass. Yeah. So that's kind of the tail end of the PJ. Another system, this is kind of at higher elevation. So we've kind of bopped around a little bit. Really, it's in elevation, it kind of goes from pinyon juniper to ponderosa pine into kind of the dry mixed conifer and then into a wet mixed conifer, which is kind of higher up. And that's going to be in the kind of spruce fir area. So at the top of our mountains up in, in the top of the Sangres and the Jemez, we have a kind of a wet mixed conifer forest. And so, these had some fire, but they experienced less fire than ponderosa pine, obviously. The fire regime is going to be less frequent. And when it does occur, it's going to be higher severity. And you can see that by the structure of the forest, right? When you see this photo on your left here, you can see how dense and how close those canopies are. If you got a fire in there, it's going to go canopy to canopy. You're going to get that active crown fire. It's going to kill a lot of these trees. And that's what we saw in the Cerro Grande fire and what we've recently seen in these systems is when we get that high severity fire, it's going to kill a lot of the trees. And there's some effects between, kind of fire intensity and insect outbreaks in these systems as well. That could be kind of create some synergies. Another system is, many of us are familiar with kind of riparian systems. This is another one in New Mexico, the Rio Grande cottonwoods, riparian cottonwood systems. These have been in kind of decline for a long time because of, river control and irrigation. They've disrupted the hydrology that these bosque systems depend upon to reproduce. So these would have historically been kind of flood propagated. So as the river flooded, it would have carried the seeds of the cottonwoods into the floodplain, and you would have had young seedlings that get their feet wet, and they would have grown up in that floodplain. As we've controlled and kind of irrigated and changed river systems, we've lost that flood propagation. And so what we've seen is we're seeing kind of the invasive species such as tamarisk or salt cedar and Russian olive have moved in and kind of crowded out willows and other native species that would have historically made up the understory in these bosque systems. And so historically, fire would not have played as much of a role in these cottonwood systems, these kind of riparian systems. But now that we're seeing invasives like tamarisk and Russian olive, they're actually quite flammable now. And so we're actually seeing, bosque systems carry fire in different ways than they might have historically, when there would have been flood plains and more moisture in those surrounding areas to kind of buffer fire, if that makes sense. And so tamarisk, for example, promotes higher fire frequency in these systems that are generally fire intolerant. Cottonwoods are not fire resistant, fire resilient, or fire recruit. They don't have any of those traits. So when fire gets into these systems, it really wreaks havoc on this cottonwood system because they're not adapted at all to that type of fire. So we're seeing, this is an example where we're seeing kind of novel effects. We're seeing this tamarisk effect on a system that's not adapted to fire. And so this kind of leads us into, where do we go from here? I've talked a lot already about kind of the role of fire in different systems. I've talked about, kind of the history and the ecology that we understand. We have this great record of fire scar data showing the role of fire in many systems across the Southwest. We know the legacy that land management has had, from fire exclusion to fire suppression. We've seen the effects of fire suppression and fire exclusion on the fuel changes and the fire regime changes in many of the systems that I just described. And it's like, where do we go from here? What is kind of in our toolbox for what we call restoring some of these forest systems to a state that allows them to stay as forests? That's really the goal here. A lot of folks talk, we've had a lot of conversation about restoring forests to past conditions, to before fire suppression. That's called moving the forest to historic range of variability. We're kind of moving them back to what they were before fire suppression. As we're seeing climate change and we're seeing more novel conditions, we're starting to have more conversations about future range of variability. How can we keep forests as forests, knowing that our systems are drying out? And so that's a conversation that is kind of using the past ecology, but it's also kind of looking at, using climate data to understand what's coming down the chute. And so there's a combination. We, of course, want to anchor into the ecology and the history of these systems, but we also want to be smart and think about what's to come. So the first step in this restoration toolbox is education, outreach, and network building. We have to talk about this. This is neighbor to neighbor. This is important to kind of, make sure that we're all on the same page. And then the next step is kind of starting to remove in some of these systems the fuel buildup. And so that involves mechanical treatments in a lot of these systems, removing some of those small trees so that we're breaking the what I call the horizontal continuity, or the proximity of tree to tree beside one another. We want to make that distance between trees bigger so that fire can't jump from tree to tree to tree to tree. So we kind of spread them out. We change the structure of the forest with mechanical treatments. And then as we've changed the structure of the forest, we can reintroduce fire where that's ecologically appropriate. And so we've changed the structure, and then we can use fire, which actually brings in some of that native seed bank. We start to kind of bring in some of that post-fire effects, which is really vital to many of these fire adapted systems. In some cases, when we have a fire ignition, a naturally ignited fire, under the right conditions, we can let that fire burn. When we have containment lines around it, if it's the right time of year, there's a large conversation, and this has been done on the Carson National Forest and other places, where they can let that fire actually do some good work out there. And this is we're not talking about, when there's crazy winds or right up next to a community, but away from communities in certain areas. This is an important tool for our toolbox, is this managed wildland fire. And it's been used very effectively in New Mexico. And then finally, reforestation. We have to understand that fire is going to happen. and we have to prepare for the post-fire environment. And we're learning a lot about that this year in New Mexico, and we have a lot of scientists working on this conversation about reforestation. New Mexico is scaling up our reforestation workforce. They're growing more seedlings than ever before by a factor of about 20, moving from about 5 million seedlings a year to almost 100,000 seedlings a year. Excuse me. Yeah, that's about right. We're by an order of about 20 growing our capacity for reforestation, for native seedling collection and nursery development, which is very exciting. And will provide employment opportunities as well. And all of this is to kind of reflect this new paradigm of how we think about our relationship to fire. We have to move away from a suppression paradigm where we put fire out and fire is the enemy and all fire is bad, to a paradigm that really reflects that fire is a natural process in these systems, and we must learn to live safely with fire. And that involves preparing for post-fire. That involves preparing for during fire, being ready to evacuate, ready, set, go, all those good things. And it involves before the fire, working around your home and doing everything that you can to make sure that you're, doing your part to reduce wildfire risk. This is that shift in how we think about fire that we're heading towards. And I want to touch more on prescribed fire because I think that's a big part of this. This is an important tool to restoring that ecological process into places where that's ecologically appropriate. And this is going to change fire behavior when we do have a wildfire. Prescribed fire is not meant to be a replacement for wildfire. That's not the intention. Prescribed fire is meant to change the fuel conditions and change the structure of the forest so that when we have wildfire, it behaves differently. Because fire is still going to happen in those areas that experience prescribed fire. It just is that when we have prescribed fire in a frequent interval, it's going to change the way it behaves when we have that naturally ignited fire. And this can be used to buffer around communities. If we use fire effectively like they have around Santa Fe and the watershed, we can create a buffer around communities so that when there is a wildfire from a lightning strike, it's going to be a lower severity fire. And to do this, we have to work across boundaries, and we have to kind of learn to manage that risk together, because it's really kind of trade-offs that we have here when it comes to fire. And again, this prescribed fire is not going to kill all the trees. It's going to lead to kind of patchy mosaic of burn effects on the landscape, and that patchy mosaic of burn effects on the landscape is going to serve us well when we have a wildfire, because it will change. It'll create a patchy mosaic of burn effects after that wildfire, and there'll be some areas that survive, and there'll be areas where we have some seedlings that can recolonize that post-fire area. But if we don't have that mosaic of fire on the landscape, we're at risk of losing great acreages to wildfire, like we've seen recently, because we have kind of overly homogeneous fire or forest conditions. And it's not a one and done. With prescribed fire, we have to kind of, like we talked about, it's a frequency thing. So we have to do this at an interval, so with somewhat regularity, every 3 to 5 years, 5 years, re-implementing prescribed fire. And it's a light touch on the landscape. I've been on prescribed fire. We do it under certain conditions so that fire really does just kind of skunk around in the understory, and it releases some of that nutrient component back into the soil. We see a lot of seedlings come up afterwards, and grasses and wildflowers. It's a very it's a gentle type of treatment. Prescribed fire. We do that. We will only light it under conditions where that's the case. There are, of course, conditions where, as we saw in this last year, that there's been devastation from the use of prescribed fire, and I'm sure there might be some questions about that, and there's been a lot of learning about that, and we can talk about that kind of towards the end here. And I've talked a lot about broadcast prescribed fire, but there's also pile burning. Cutting some trees, piling them up, and burning those piles in the winter, for example. The organization that I work with does a lot of winter pile burning. So we do it when there's snow on the ground. There's very little risk or less risk of those piles escaping. And then we go back and make sure they're all put out. or we can use infrared cameras to tell us if there's heat in any of those piles. There's a lot of tools to make prescribed fire safer, and that's how folks are talking about it now. There's been a lot of emphasis on how we can do prescribed fire in a more safe and effective way. An example of how prescribed fire has been used effectively was in the Medio fire, which was in 2018 around Santa Fe. Mechanical treatments and prescribed fire were done in Pacheco Canyon a couple years prior to the Medio fire. As you can see here in red, that's where the treatment was. And that created basically a catcher's mitt that stopped the spread of the Medio fire. It allowed agency firefighters to get a foothold in that landscape. In some landscapes, they can't get a foothold. If it's just continuous, kind of homogeneous forest conditions, there's nowhere for them to anchor into. So this prescribed fire provided them a place where they could kind of get strategic and really make a stand against that fire. So that's how these prescribed fire treatments can really work in fire response as well. As you know, we talked a lot about the ecology, but they also really help when we're talking about kind of putting fires out as well. This is a great success. I think I'm getting towards the end here. I've talked a little bit about thinning already, so I might kind of just move through this. But basically, we're trying to, return forest structures back to kind of historic conditions when we're doing forest thinning. Reforestation, again, this is an important part of kind of how New Mexico's scaling up our workforce. It's primarily ponderosa pine. It's hard to get good seed source. And so, that's part of the kind of puzzle here. And we're working hard to kind of scale that up in New Mexico. Santa Ana Pueblo is going to be a site for a nursery. Many other Pueblo governments are starting to kind of talk about how they might develop their capacity to be a part of this reforestation as well. Here's some photos from reforestation efforts. And really what we're trying to do here is kind of prevent forest type conversion. Sometimes after a large high severity fire, we see forests kind of stay as shrub fields for a very long time. As gamble oak primarily will come in, and then it will reburn and it will reburn, and forests can get kind of locked into this shrub state. And this matters because of how carbon is stored in forests. Forests are very effective at storing carbon. And, with climate change, we really want to keep forests as forests. And not just for the carbon, but for the importance of these for habitat, we all like to recreate. Many of us like to recreate in these forests. There are many values, water, the production of water, that these forests kind of holding snow on that landscape longer than shrubs would. So we want to keep forests as forests for many different reasons. And we want to kind of do that reforestation so that they don't get locked into a shrub field and have this permanent type conversion to gamble oak. And there's been some of that with the Las Conchas fire and the Cerro Grande. I'm sure many of you have maybe seen, gamble oak can really get a foothold and create kind of these large shrub fields. This is just, showing that, climate change is affecting fire severity. We're seeing a lot of change in fire severity. I won't spend too much time because we're right at the top of the hour. There are many ways that y'all can get involved. Maybe there's a local watershed coalition. In Santa Fe, we have the Greater Santa Fe Fireshed Coalition. This is a place where folks can kind of get involved in the conversation about federal land management. They can kind of talk directly to kind of agency officials about how the watershed is being managed. I'm sure there's the Jemez Mountains Collaborative out here that's involved with the Jemez Mountains Collaborative Landscape Forestry Treatment. There are many other collaborative groups. I encourage you to kind of see if there's a watershed association or something like that that's involved in this conversation about forest management. That might be a way that you can get involved. Another way is getting involved with the Fire Adapted Communities New Mexico Learning Network, or the Fire Adapted New Mexico Learning Network. This is something I help coordinate. This is a place for information sharing, peer learning, and relationship building. So just kind of getting folks the resources they need and kind of the contacts that they need to make their communities safer to fire. And so we have some community leaders in the Jemez Mountains, in Sierra de los Pinos. We have community leaders up in, kind of near Jemez Mountains up in Thompson Ridge, a lot of different community leaders in this area. And we do a lot of webinars, in-person events, things like that. So if you're interested in kind of staying involved in that conversation about fire, you can check out facnm.org or the Santa Fe Fireshed.org, or feel free to email me. I'd be happy to kind of field questions or kind of get you tied in to the conversation if that's something you're interested in. And with that, I'll open it up. I hope I didn't go too far over.
Oh, no, I think you're good. We have a couple questions. Did you want to mention the program tomorrow as well?
Yeah. Tomorrow, there's a webinar from the Santa Fe National Forest that's specifically about their review of the use of prescribed fire on the Santa Fe National Forest. So this will go into the depth of how they're changing their burn program in the wake of the Calf Canyon Hermit Peak. I talked a lot about kind of the forest and fire ecology and kind of the rationale, but if you want to hear the nitty-gritty details of kind of how they're retooling their process for the use of prescribed fire, go on the Santa Fe National Forest Facebook page tomorrow at noon. It's going to be live streamed. It will be on their Facebook page in perpetuity. So you can look, if you don't catch it tomorrow, it'll still be on their live videos, and you can tune in at whenever it works for you. But tomorrow at noon, you'll have the opportunity to put questions in the comment section, and we'll relay those to our speakers. So you can actually interact with the speakers on Facebook that way. And so, yeah, I encourage you. It's hosted by the Santa Fe National Forest, but the Fire Adapted New Mexico Learning Network is helping with the coordination of that. So we want to make sure folks have an opportunity to hear from Santa Fe National Forest. The forest supervisor will be on there, and their fire management officer as well. So it's a great opportunity to kind of hear firsthand some of those changes.
Awesome, thank you. So we have two really great questions, and I'm going to ask them out of sequence. I'm a homeowner near the interface of Pinon Juniper Forest. What forestry practices should I encourage near my home?
This is a great question. So we talked a lot tonight about kind of forest ecology. We talked about kind of the history of, what these systems would have looked like before human settlement. That's one kind of lens that we look at. Up against our homes, we kind of look at it from a different lens. So that's important. Up against your home, we're not so much looking to return those forests to their ecological state. We're looking at them from a wildfire risk reduction perspective. So if you're in a pinyon juniper forest, you're going to start from your structure and you're going to work your way outward, and you're going to look at what's called defensible space. And so in that 5-foot zone immediately around your home, you don't want to have any combustible vegetation. 5 feet. 5 feet to 30 feet is kind of the next zone. And in that next zone, from 5 feet to 30 feet, you can have a couple trees, but you don't want them close in proximity to one another, and you don't want them creating a kind of a ladder fuel situation where it can go from the surface into the tree. And then from 30 feet out to 100 feet, there's even another kind of level of guidance. So I encourage you to look at the defensible space principles. We don't really, think you're not going to want to think about kind of the historic forest ecology when it's right up against your home. I encourage you to look more at wildfire risk. We kind of change values when we're thinking about right up against our homes. So thinking about your structure and what you can do to make your structure protected from embers, and doing that treatment, defensible space treatments going away from your structure, are going to be the two really important things. The defensible space is like kind of the vegetation surrounding your home. The home hardening is actually, putting on, cleaning your gutters and making sure you have, wildfire resistant windows, making sure you have screens on your dryer vents, things like that. Because when we see wildfire, the thing that a lot of folks don't think about is we see that 80% of home ignitions are from embers. And embers it's like a snowstorm of fire. And if you've got a fire near your home, think about how snow would be blowing in a blizzard. And then think about if all those snowflakes in a blizzard were embers. blowing up against your home. So you really want to harden that structure so that those embers can't get up, they can't get caught in a corner with some pine needles and things like that. So that's what I would say is I would point you to home hardening and defensible space.
Awesome. Thank you. That was super helpful. What do you see as the role of citizen science? What role can citizen scientists play in this?
Yeah. I think it's a really important role that citizen science can play. There's a variety of different ways that citizens can get involved with forest monitoring. So whenever we do a forestry treatment, the organization that I work with, the Forest Guild, does what's called pre-treatment and post-treatment monitoring. And we go out and we count trees and we count sticks and we look at, we do grids, and we do that in a way that's, statistically, that we can say something about how we've affected the forest. So that monitoring piece, there's a lot of different types of forest monitoring. Some of it's about the trees, some of it's about birds, some of it's about understory plants. There's a lot of ways that citizen science can inform that monitoring process, where you could take a photo with your phone and it can actually tell the Forest Service something about, oh, we saw this rare species of understory plant in an area that we didn't know it existed. So I encourage you, again, working with a local watershed coalition or a collaborative in your area, getting involved in that conversation. They'll know there might be volunteer opportunities. You're gonna want to kind of get networked in locally. And a lot of the best places to look are watershed coalitions or collaboratives, things like that, landscape collaboratives. That's the kind of language you're going to look for. And that's something that, if you're interested in that, again, the Fire Adapted New Mexico Learning Network can be can play operator a little bit. We can try and find someone in your area that you can get connected to. That's that networking idea. So if you're interested in kind of where do I get my foot in the door or something like that, feel free to reach out to the Learning Network and we can kind of find the right contact or try and help you with that. But yeah, I see citizen science as really important to building trust with our land management agencies. These federal and state tribal land managers really want to do right by their communities. And I work with a lot of these folks, but without input from community members, it's a real challenge. And so that can be in the form of citizen science, or that can be in the form of kind of public participation in their, town hall meetings or informational events like what we're doing tomorrow with Santa Fe. Those types of events are really important to kind of create that interaction with agencies. And I see citizen science as kind of part of that relationship building process.
Totally. So I just had one question, and then I think we'll call it a night unless someone else pops up, which is, you mentioned the growing of seedlings. Are they harvesting and locating those seeds locally, or are they from elsewhere?
Yes, they're harvested locally. There is, I love this. There's the tree climbing workforce is going to grow substantially. Like, having paid crews that go out and climb trees when the forests are masting, like when they have a fresh crop of seeds, and collecting those pine cones. There will be a whole workforce around that in New Mexico in the coming years. And, young people can get certified to be tree climbers and to, and nursery assistants. We'll need folks that know how to grow seedlings and manage nurseries. And, we're talking about a whole new kind of forest workforce here. That's really exciting for New Mexico to grow into. And that's happening. There's been investment in that. So, yeah, New Mexico State Forestry Division is kind of leading the charge in that. I encourage you to kind of stay in the loop, get on their newsletters, get, kind of roped into New Mexico State Forestry Division's communications. And that's where you'll hear about kind of job opportunities, training opportunities, things like that about this kind of reforestation effort.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So I don't nope, no other questions have come in. So since we are a little past 8, I think we're going to call it a night. Thank you so much, Gabe, for sharing your expertise with us. This was wonderful and really informative. And thank you to everyone on Zoom and in the room for joining us this evening.